Søren Kierkegaard is often described as the father of existentialism, but this description obscures more than it clarifies. Kierkegaard did not set out to establish a philosophical school, nor did he attempt to construct a coherent system of thought. In fact, he regarded the very impulse to build systems as one of the greatest dangers facing modern thought. Kierkegaard's work emerges in direct opposition to a culture obsessed with explanation. 19th century European philosophy, especially under the influence of Hegel, aspired to totality. Everything, history, ethics, religion, reason, was meant to be reconciled within a single rational structure. From the standpoint of the system, contradictions dissolve and meaning becomes intelligible. Kierkegaard did not deny the brilliance of this ambition. He denied its relevance to existence. A philosophical system, no matter how complete, does not live. It does not choose. It does not suffer. It does not stand in anxiety before a decision whose outcome cannot be known in advance. Only the individual exists in this way, and Kierkegaard believed modern philosophy had quietly abandoned this fact. For Kierkegaard, the problem was not that philosophy had become false, but that it had become detached. It explained life from the outside, transforming living experience into concepts that could be examined without being endured. In doing so, it allowed individuals to mistake understanding for existence. This mistake, Kierkegaard believed, was catastrophic. A person could explain ethics perfectly and still live evasively. They could describe faith with precision and never believe. They could analyze despair and never confront their own. Knowledge became a refuge from responsibility, and abstraction became a way of avoiding commitment. Kierkegaard's response was radical. He refused to participate in philosophy as system building. Instead, he redirected thought toward the existing individual, the single human being who must act without guarantees. This is why Kierkegaard's writing does not resemble conventional philosophy. He does not begin with definitions or axioms. He begins with situations: anxiety, choice, despair, faith. These are not problems to be solved, but conditions that reveal what it means to exist. At the center of Kierkegaard's thought is a distinction that governs everything else: the difference between objective understanding and subjective existence. Objective understanding seeks distance, neutrality, and explanation. Subjective existence demands involvement, risk, and responsibility. Modern thought, Kierkegaard argued, overwhelmingly favors the former. It praises detachment, reflection, and analysis. Kierkegaard saw this not as progress, but as a subtle form of evasion. Reflection can become a way of postponing action indefinitely. One thinks instead of choosing. One analyses instead of committing. Existence, however, does not wait. A human life unfolds in time, under conditions of uncertainty. Decisions must be made before certainty is available. Commitments bind the individual long before outcomes are known. No system can absorb these risks on the individual's behalf. Kierkegaard's philosophy begins here, not with theory, but with the uncomfortable fact that to exist is to be responsible without guarantees. This is the foundation on which everything else in his work is built. Kierkegaard believed that the greatest threat to the individual was not ignorance, immorality, or disbelief, but reflection without inwardness. Reflection, in his sense, is the endless turning of thought back upon itself. Analysis, comparison, hesitation, and qualification, without decisive commitment. It produces intelligence without courage and understanding without action. Reflection is not evil. Kierkegaard was not anti-thinking, but reflection becomes dangerous when it replaces existence. In a reflective culture, one becomes highly skilled at explaining one's life while remaining untouched by it. Decisions are postponed in the name of prudence. Commitments are deferred until conditions are perfect. One waits for clarity that never arrives. Life is lived in preparation rather than in actuality. Kierkegaard saw this everywhere around him. His contemporaries were educated, articulate, and morally informed. They discussed ethics endlessly. They debated religion publicly. They held opinions on everything. And yet, Kierkegaard believed their lives were marked by avoidance. They knew what was right, but did not do it. They understood faith, but did not believe. They reflected endlessly, but did not exist inwardly. This gap between understanding and living is what Kierkegaard calls a loss of inwardness. Inwardness does not mean emotional intensity or private feeling. It means the degree to which a person stands behind their beliefs and actions as their own. An inward life is one in which decisions are not outsourced to convention, systems, or public opinion. Reflection tends to dissolve inwardness. The more one reflects, the easier it becomes to distance oneself from one's own life. One becomes a spectator of oneself, analyzing motives rather than choosing, explaining failures rather than risking responsibility. Reflection multiplies possibilities, but it weakens decision. Kierkegaard famously warns that reflection can make action impossible. When every choice is seen from all sides, when every commitment is undermined by awareness of alternatives, paralysis sets in. One becomes clever at seeing why no choice is fully justified. The result is not freedom, but hesitation. This hesitation has moral consequences. A reflective person can excuse almost anything. If circumstances are complex enough, responsibility can always be softened. If explanations are sophisticated enough, guilt can always be displaced. Reflection becomes a defense mechanism, a way of avoiding the weight of decision. Kierkegaard believed modern culture rewarded this posture. Reflection is admired. Commitment is viewed with suspicion. Passion is treated as naivete. Certainty is mocked. Irony replaces seriousness. The result is a culture of spectators rather than actors. This cultural tendency is inseparable from Kierkegaard's critique of the crowd. Reflection thrives in public discourse, where opinions circulate without ownership. In the crowd, individuals do not stand behind what they say. They repeat, comment, and react. Responsibility dissolves into anonymity. For Kierkegaard, the crowd is not merely a social phenomenon. It is an existential one. In the crowd, the individual loses themselves without noticing. Decisions are justified by consensus. Beliefs are adopted because they are common. Moral responsibility is replaced by social approval. This is why Kierkegaard insists on the importance of the single individual. The single individual is not isolated from others, but inwardly independent. They do not borrow meaning from the crowd. They do not hide behind institutions, traditions, or public opinion. When they choose as themselves. This does not guarantee correctness. Kierkegaard is not concerned with being right in an abstract sense. He is concerned with being responsible. A mistaken choice owned inwardly is more authentic than a correct choice adopted passively. This emphasis marks a decisive break with system thinking. Systems promise reconciliation without risk. They offer meaning without commitment. They explain responsibility away by embedding it in structures larger than the individual. Kierkegaard rejects this entirely. Existence cannot be lived by proxy. No philosophy, institution, or tradition can choose on your behalf. Even refusing to choose is itself a choice, one that carries consequences. Kierkegaard's insistence on inwardness is therefore not psychological advice. It is an existential demand. It asks whether a person is willing to live without the shelter of abstraction, without hiding behind reflection, and without dissolving responsibility into the crowd. This demand is uncomfortable, but for Kierkegaard, discomfort is not a defect. It is a sign that existence is being taken seriously. Kierkegaard's insistence on the single individual reaches its sharpest expression in his critique of the crowd. This critique is often misunderstood as elitism or antisocial withdrawal. In fact, it is neither. Kierkegaard is not attacking people. He is attacking a structure that dissolves responsibility. For Kierkegaard, the crowd is dangerous precisely because it feels safe. When individuals act as part of a collective, responsibility becomes diffuse. No one stands fully behind what is done. Decisions are justified by numbers. Beliefs are validated by repetition. Passion is replaced by opinion and conviction by consensus. In the crowd, no one is accountable and everyone feels justified. Kierkegaard believed this was one of the defining features of modern life. As societies became more public, mediated, and opinion-driven, individuals increasingly understood themselves through external validation. Newspapers, public debate, and later mass culture encouraged people to think about everything while committing to nothing. The crowd, Kierkegaard argued, is always irresponsible, not because it intends harm, but because it cannot act inwardly. Responsibility requires ownership. Ownership requires singularity. The crowd, by definition, erases both. This is why Kierkegaard insists that truth must always be addressed to the individual. A truth that applies to everyone equally often binds no one in particular. It becomes abstract, general, and harmless. When truth loses its capacity to demand action from a specific person, it becomes decoration. Kierkegaard's emphasis on the single individual is therefore ethical before it is philosophical. Only the individual can choose. Only the individual can commit. Only the individual can repent, believe, or despair. The crowd cannot do these things. It can only comment on them. This insight leads Kierkegaard to one of his most unsettling claims. The crowd is untruth. This does not mean that majorities are always wrong, or that solitude guarantees correctness. It means that truth, in the existential sense that matters to Kierkegaard, cannot be lived collectively. It must be appropriated personally. A belief held because it is popular is not believed. A value adopted because it is praised is not owned. A commitment entered because it is expected is not chosen. Kierkegaard's concern here is not correctness but sincerity. The crowd encourages self-deception. It allows individuals to feel committed without risk, righteous without responsibility, and involved without inwardness. One can belong without choosing, speak without standing behind words, and act without accountability. This is why Kierkegaard repeatedly warns against public opinion. Public opinion, he argues, is not formed by passion or conviction, but by imitation. It circulates endlessly, detached from responsibility. People repeat what is already being said, not because they believe it inwardly, but because it is socially rewarded. The crowd thus becomes a mechanism for evasion. Kierkegaard believed that modern individuals were not lacking in information or moral awareness. They were lacking in courage. The courage to stand alone inwardly, to accept responsibility without appeal, and to act without guarantees of approval. The single individual represents the opposite posture. To exist as a single individual is not to reject others, but to refuse to outsource one's life. It means that when one chooses, one cannot say, "Everyone else thinks this," or "This is what is done." One must say, "This is my choice." This posture is lonely. Kierkegaard does not romanticize it. He acknowledges that standing as an individual against the crowd invites misunderstanding, ridicule, and isolation. But he insists that this loneliness is preferable to the emptiness of a life lived without ownership. In this sense, Kierkegaard's philosophy is deeply demanding. He does not offer techniques for self-expression or authenticity. He offers a confrontation. Are you willing to exist without the shelter of anonymity? The crowd promises safety. The individual demands responsibility. Kierkegaard believed that only the latter makes a human life meaningful. Kierkegaard is routinely described as the father of existentialism, yet this label distorts his project in subtle but important ways. While later existential thinkers drew heavily from his work, Kierkegaard himself would have resisted being grouped into a philosophical movement defined by shared doctrines or themes. For Kierkegaard, the danger of becoming a type is precisely the danger he spent his life opposing. Existentialism, as it later developed, often became a recognizable position, a set of ideas about freedom, anxiety, authenticity, and meaning. Kierkegaard's thought cannot be reduced in this way. He was not offering a worldview to be adopted, but an existential challenge to be lived. This distinction matters. To treat Kierkegaard as an existentialist thinker alongside others is to risk neutralizing him. Once his work becomes a category, it becomes safe. It can be taught, compared, summarized, and debated without disturbing the life of the reader. Kierkegaard believed this was the fate of all ideas that became respectable. He wrote precisely to avoid that fate. Kierkegaard's concern was never to explain existence in general. It was to confront the individual with their own existence. His work does not ask, "What is the human condition?" but "How are you living yours?" This focus sets him apart from later existentialists. Where many existential philosophers analyze freedom, Kierkegaard insists on decision. Where they explore anxiety as a universal structure, Kierkegaard treats anxiety as a personal encounter with possibility. Where they critique social norms, Kierkegaard targets the individual's willingness to hide behind them. Kierkegaard does not speak about humanity in the abstract. He speaks to a single person. This is why his writing is so difficult to assimilate into academic philosophy. It resists generalization. Each claim points back to the reader's life rather than outward to a theory. Kierkegaard does not seek agreement, he seeks appropriation. This resistance also explains why Kierkegaard cannot be comfortably secularized. Although he is often presented as a psychological or existential thinker, his work is inseparable from his engagement with Christianity. Yet this engagement does not resemble conventional theology. Kierkegaard attacks institutional Christianity more fiercely than many secular critics. He does so because Christianity, in his view, had been turned into a cultural identity rather than an existential demand. People were Christians by birth, habit, or social expectation, not by risk or commitment. Faith had become easy. Kierkegaard regarded this as a betrayal. Christianity, he argued, is not meant to be reasonable, comforting, or socially reinforcing. It is meant to confront the individual with paradox, offense, and the demand for inward transformation. To make it socially respectable is to destroy it. This stance further complicates Kierkegaard's classification. He is too religious for secular existentialism, too critical for institutional theology, too personal for system-building philosophy, and too philosophically rigorous for devotional writing. Every attempt to categorize him misses something essential. This is not accidental. Kierkegaard deliberately placed himself at the margins of intellectual life. He refused the security of belonging to a school or movement because belonging dilutes responsibility. A thinker who speaks for a group no longer speaks as an individual. Kierkegaard wanted no disciples. He wanted readers who would confront themselves. This refusal to become a type is one of Kierkegaard's most radical gestures. It ensures that his work remains unstable, demanding and resistant to easy consumption. One cannot simply be a Kierkegaardian without betraying his central insight. To take Kierkegaard seriously is not to adopt a position, it is to accept a demand. Kierkegaard remains disturbing because he refuses to offer the forms of relief modern readers expect from philosophy. He does not reassure, he does not stabilize, he does not provide a framework that makes life easier to manage or explain. Instead, he exposes the strategies by which individuals avoid responsibility while convincing themselves they are living thoughtfully. This exposure is uncomfortable precisely because it still applies. Modern culture is saturated with language about selfhood, meaning, and authenticity. We speak easily about anxiety, identity, and purpose. Psychological insight is widely available. Moral discourse is constant. And yet, Kierkegaard's central diagnosis remains intact. Understanding has expanded while commitment has weakened. We know more than ever about why we live as we do, and still struggle to live differently. Kierkegaard would not be impressed by this sophistication. He would see it as further evidence of reflection, replacing existence. Explanation has become a substitute for decision. Awareness has replaced action. One can endlessly interpret one's life while postponing responsibility for it. This is why Kierkegaard's work resists therapeutic appropriation. Although he is often cited in discussions of anxiety and despair, Kierkegaard does not treat these as problems to be solved. Anxiety is not pathology. It is the dizziness of freedom, the recognition that one must choose without certainty. Despair is not sadness. It is a misrelation of the self to itself, a failure to become who one is. To remove anxiety and despair entirely would not be progress, it would be evasion. Kierkegaard insists that these conditions are inseparable from freedom. A life without anxiety would be a life without possibility. A life without despair would be a life without selfhood. Modern attempts to eliminate discomfort often miss this point, treating existential conditions as errors rather than signals. This insistence makes Kierkegaard difficult to assimilate into self-help culture. Self-help promises improvement without risk. It offers techniques rather than demands. Kierkegaard offers no techniques. He offers confrontation. He asks whether the reader is willing to stand behind their life without guarantees, without external validation, and without appeal to systems that dissolve responsibility. This is why Kierkegaard cannot be consumed passively. His writing turns the reader back on themselves. It asks not whether an idea is interesting, but whether it is being lived. It exposes the distance between what one admires and what one chooses. It reveals the comfort hidden in reflection, irony, and detachment. Kierkegaard's disturbance is therefore ethical rather than intellectual. He does not threaten beliefs so much as habits. He challenges the ways individuals avoid inwardness while convincing themselves they are thoughtful, open-minded, and informed. He forces the reader to ask whether they are living deliberately or merely drifting while explaining themselves. This challenge has only intensified in the modern world. Social media, public discourse, and constant comparison amplify the crowd Kierkegaard warned against. Opinions circulate instantly. Identity becomes performative. Responsibility is displaced into trends, movements, and collective outrage. One can feel involved without being accountable. Kierkegaard's insistence on the single individual cuts directly against this. He demands that the individual step out of anonymity inwardly, not by rejecting society, but by refusing to let it decide on their behalf. He asks whether one is willing to exist as oneself rather than as a reflection of what is expected. This demand does not expire. It cannot be automated, systematized, or delegated. It must be renewed repeatedly through choices that involve risk and uncertainty. Kierkegaard offers no final resolution because existence itself offers none. This is why Kierkegaard endures, not because he provides answers, but because he refuses to allow escape from the question. His work remains alive because it does not settle into doctrine. It continues to disturb wherever individuals prefer explanation to commitment and reflection to responsibility. Kierkegaard does not tell us how to live. He asks whether we are willing to live at all, as individuals without guarantees.